Hello, it's Joe Simhart here again for another installment of Cults in the Occulture. I'm dressed up a bit better than I normally am for these short videos. I just came from a funeral. Funerals tend to sober us up a bit, make us think more deeply about our lives and meaning and, how we want to continue with what we're doing. Anyway, I think you all know what I mean about that. What I want to cover today is what I read a few weeks ago regarding one of the defendants in the Capitol riot trials that have been taking place lately of people accused of some or another crime. And this particular statement from September 24th from an article says a federal judge tore into a low-level defendant in the Capitol riot Friday, moments after the man entered a guilty plea to a misdemeanor charge stemming from the January 6 unrest. Quote, "You've disgraced this country in the eyes of the world, and my inclination would be to lock you up. But since the government isn't asking me to do that, I won't." U.S. District Court Judge Reggie Walton shouted at Fort Pierce, Florida resident Anthony Mariota during a video hearing. Quote, "I find it outrageous that American citizens would do what you did. So you better walk the straight and narrow, sir. Do you understand?" "I do, Your Honor," Mariota replied meekly. Okay, so this guy pled guilty. Perhaps he woke up and realized that the whole thing he got caught up in was a mistake, and maybe he has to rethink what that was all about. I don't know. Or maybe he pled out because he didn't want to go to trial and get sentenced to something even more harsh. But where does this all come from? How do people get caught up? He may have obviously been leaning right. He started looking into the whole gathering about Stop the Steal and what are we going to do about this? We need to take back our government from these awful left-wingers bringing Marxism into the country. All that narrative that fires up the alt-right. But there's something happens to the human being when you get caught up in something like this, and I certainly did. I can remember this happening to me when I started going to these conferences that Church Universal and Triumphant set up. I mean, after the first one, I was caught up in a movement, and I felt emotionally connected. It all made sense in some way or another. I'm going to refer to this kind of Bible of deprogrammers from back in the 70s and 80s called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism by Robert J Lifton, published around 1961, based on his studies of brainwashing in China and what happened to the citizens there, as well as dissidents that had been put into re-education camps in China. So he begins this chapter by saying, thought reform has a psychological momentum of its own, a self-perpetuating energy, not always bound by the interests of the program's directors. All right, so this is important. Some people may want to start something that's transcendent, like, this is really bad for the country. We need to meet. We need to fire up the troops. The troops get fired up, and the leaders see that, wow, this is really going a lot faster than I expected, and they get caught up in it themselves. So sometimes the leaders get caught up in the cult just as much as the followers do. They don't necessarily lead it. So this idea of ideological totalism has a momentum of its own. It's an energy beyond the players, beyond the leader, and beyond the adherents. When we inquire into the sources of this momentum, we come upon a complex set of psychological themes, which may be grouped under the general heading of ideological totalism. By this ungainly phrase, I mean to suggest the coming together of immoderate ideology with equally immoderate individual character traits, an extremist meeting ground between people and ideas. In discussing tendencies toward individual totalism within my subjects, I made it clear that these were a matter of degree, and that some potential for this form of all or nothing emotional alignment exists within everyone. we're all vulnerable to Charlie Manson's influence. I don't care who the hell you are. If you were in the right circumstance, if you're smart enough to understand a guy like that, you might fall under his sway. So, we're all vulnerable. Similarly, any ideology, that is, any set of emotionally charged convictions about a man and his relationship to the natural or supernatural world may be carried by its adherents into a totalistic direction. But this is most likely to occur within those ideologies which are most sweeping in their content and most ambitious or messianic in their claims, whether religious, political, or scientific. And where totalism exists, a religion, a political movement, or even a scientific organization becomes little more than an exclusive cult. And that's in page 419 of this book in chapter 22. Again, thought reform in the psychology of totalism. So going back to this young man, Mr. Mariota, he got caught up in this. He went into immoderate. In other words, he wasn't moderating his thoughts anymore. He got into an immoderate relationship with this movement. And it was messianic. It was God-inspired. God brought Trump to us. You know, the voters can't take him away. This is God's will. So we got to do something about this. And this is messianic. This is religious. This is even beyond the political. When people get caught up in that, they begin thinking that the will of God has to be implemented by them because the will of God is within them. And so you have human beings acting out these godlike tendencies, which are fascist. When you combine theocracy with politics, you end up with fascist or very authoritarian movements that believe that the dogma of the leader is what should rule the country. And I think this young man got caught up in that, and maybe he backed away from it and realized that, yeah, this is wrong. I was guilty, and he pled so. However, it's not so easy to wake up by just pleading guilty. It can take years for some people to unravel what really happened to them in this kind of a idea of the psychology of totalism, of how thought reform works and how groups can influence us. So, you know, if you get a chance, read Robert Lifton's chapter 22. As a deprogrammer, I've used this hundreds of times on cases to help people understand what kind of situation they got involved in. And it seemed to apply for most people in just about any kind of group, whether it was martial arts, some kind of Bible cult, an Eastern guru religion, a political cult, an atheist movement that got out of control. I mean, it applies across the board because Robert Lifton was looking at the principles behind this kind of activity, behind getting caught up in a movement. So take a look at Lifton's work. I think you would learn something from it if you've been caught up in a movement like that. Or are just interested in how all of that works. Another book that you could use is called Brainwashing, the Psychology of Totalism by Kathleen Taylor that came out, and she looks at Lifton's work as applied to the neuropsychology and the neuroscience behind brainwashing. Let me see if I can get the book here quickly. Yeah, that book looks something like this, and she does rely on Lifton's work as well. It's worth a read. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you for listening, and take care of yourselves today.